In 1963, a single industrial powerhouse in Chicago dictated the pace of the American cycling world, controlling a staggering quarter of the entire domestic market. From the manicured suburbs of Connecticut to the sun-drenched coast of California, the odds were 1 in 4 that any bicycle found in a family garage bore the iconic Schwinn name stamped in gleaming chrome. This was the brand that defined the American childhood, pioneering the balloon tire cruiser, the dependable paperboy bike, and the aggressive muscle bike with its signature banana seat, the ultimate object of desire for every child in the country. At its zenith, the company's sprawling Chicago complex was a hive of perpetual motion, operating 3 shifts around the clock with 1,800 workers to churn out over 1 million units annually. The brand was so coveted that prospective buyers often languished on 6-month waiting lists just for the privilege of ownership. Yet this seemingly invincible empire, which had weathered the Great Depression and 2 world wars, was hurtling toward a cliff. By 1983, the once thundering factory floors were ghostly and silent. Within 8 years, the company would collapse into bankruptcy, its market share withered to 5%, and its legacy buried under $82 million in debt. It is a haunting saga of how an immigrant's precision-engineered dream became a global dynasty, only to be dismantled by a fatal cocktail of generational arrogance and a refusal to acknowledge a changing world. The story begins in Hardheim, Germany in 1871, where an 11-year-old Ignaz Schwinn stood at his father's graveside, facing a future of sudden poverty. Sent away to a mechanical trade school, Ignaz traded play for the rigorous study of lathes, gears, and metallurgy.
This forced maturity became his greatest asset. By 16, he was a wandering apprentice, traversing Germany with a toolbox and a keen eye for the bicycle revolution sweeping Europe. He was more than a mechanic, he was a scholar of friction and frame geometry, filling notebooks with designs for the future. His talent eventually landed him a leadership role at Heinrich Kleier's advanced bicycle plant in Frankfurt, where by age 29 he helped design the massive Adler Works. Despite the success, Ignaz felt stifled by the saturated European market. Seeing a vast, untapped frontier across the Atlantic, he boarded a steamship in 1891 and arrived in Chicago with nothing but his expertise and an iron will. He quickly rose through the ranks of local manufacturers, but he grew weary of enriching others with his innovations. At 33, he was one of the finest engineers in America, yet he remained an employee, staring at his ceiling each night and calculating the wealth he was creating for men who lacked his vision. The turning point arrived in 1894 during a meeting with Adolf Frederick William Arnold, a titan of the meatpacking and banking industries. Arnold possessed the capital, and Ignaz possessed the genius. They struck a deal that bypassed bureaucratic interference, birthing Arnold, Schwinn and Company in 1895. Their debut line, aptly named World Bicycles, set a new standard for precision. While Chicago was teeming with over 300 manufacturers during the Great Bicycle Craze, Ignaz realized that a gold rush inevitably ends in a bust. While his competitors sacrificed quality for volume, Ignaz obsessed over weld integrity and frame geometry, building machines meant to last decades rather than months. He wasn't just selling a mode of transport, he was building a reputation for indestructible quality. As the industry began its inevitable contraction, Schwinn's commitment to superior engineering ensured that while others folded, his empire was just beginning to take root, setting the stage for a century of American dominance.
Just as Ignaz predicted, the bubble didn't just leak, it burst with violent force. By the turn of the century, the bicycle craze that had gripped America evaporated. The market was flooded with cheap inventory, prices plummeted, and over 250 of those 300 Chicago manufacturers vanished overnight. Factories were shuttered, fortunes were lost, and the gold rush turned into a graveyard. But amidst the wreckage, Arnold, Schwinn, and company didn't just stand, they expanded. Ignaz's obsession with quality over quick profits became his lifeboat. While others liquidated, he began acquiring, buying up the patents and machinery of his fallen competitors for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just surviving the crash, he was organizing the chaos. By 1908, Ignaz had grown tired of answering to a partner, even a silent one. He bought out Adolf Arnold, taking absolute control of the company. Now, solely in the hands of the Schwinn family, the factory pivoted. Ignaz, restless and always chasing the next mechanical frontier, set his sights on the roaring new world of motorcycles. He purchased the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company and later Henderson, creating some of the finest motorcycles the world had ever seen. For a moment, it seemed the bicycle might just be a footnote in the Schwinn legacy, a stepping stone to internal combustion. But history and the economy had other plans.
The stock market crash of 1929 brought the roaring 20s to a screeching halt. The luxury market for motorcycles disintegrated, and Ignaz, now an aging titan, made the heartbreaking decision to axe the motorcycle division to save the company. The factory floors fell quiet. The future looked bleak. It was here that Ignaz's son, Frank W. Schwinn, stepped out of his father's shadow. Frank was different, less of a rigid engineer, more of a visionary gambler. He looked at the bicycles of the era, thin tires, flimsy frames, uncomfortable rides, and saw a product that hadn't changed in 30 years. If they were to convince Americans to spend money during the Great Depression, they didn't need a better bicycle, they needed a completely different machine. Frank looked at the automotive industry and saw the answer in the tires. Cars ran on low-pressure balloon tires that absorbed the bumps of the road. Why were bicycles still rattling teeth on high-pressure rubber? In 1933, against the advice of almost every dealer who said it looked too heavy and clumsy, Schwinn introduced the B10E motorbike. It featured massive 2.125-inch balloon tires, streamlined fenders, and a tank that mimicked a motorcycle's gas tank. It was heavy, it was bold, and it looked like nothing else on the road. The industry mocked it until the sales figures came in. Kids didn't just ride it, they felt like they were piloting a motorcycle. It was tough, rugged, and undeniably cool. Frank had invented the cruiser, single-handedly reviving the American bicycle industry in the depths of the Depression. This success laid the groundwork for the company's golden age. By the 1950s, Schwinn wasn't just a brand, it was the standard. But the greatest revolution was yet to come. In the early 1960s, a strange trend started bubbling up on the West Coast. Kids were taking old bike frames, chopping them up, adding high-rise handlebars and long banana seats to mimic the look of drag racing choppers. They called them high-risers. A Schwinn engineer traveling in California saw these Frankenbikes and rushed back to Chicago with a sketch. The executives were skeptical. The bike looked ridiculous. Tiny wheels, distorted proportions, impossible geometry. But Al Fritz, a key Schwinn designer, fought for it. In 1963, Schwinn unveiled the Stingray. It was unlike any bicycle ever mass-produced. It was nimble, it allowed for wheelies and skid stops, and it dripped with attitude. The response was instantaneous pandemonium. Every child in America needed one. Schwinn sold 40,000 units in the first few months alone. By the end of the decade, they had sold millions. The Stingray didn't just sell, it culturally indoctrinated a generation. It cemented Schwinn's dominance so thoroughly that by the late 60s, the company felt untouchable. They controlled the market, the technology, and the hearts of the consumer. But hubris is a slow-acting poison. Sitting atop the world, running factories at capacity, the Schwinn family began to believe their own myth. They believed that made in Chicago was the only stamp that mattered, and that the lightweight racing bikes starting to appear in Europe were just a passing fad. They were wrong, and this time there would be no young visionary to steer them away from the cliff. The landscape of American cycling shifted violently in the early 1970s, moving away from the playful antics of childhood driveways and onto the open road.
A new craze for adult physical fitness swept the nation, and suddenly the heavy, indestructible steel cruisers that made Schwinn famous were obsolete. Adults didn't want toys, they wanted speed. They wanted the lightweight 10-speed racing bicycles that were pouring in from Europe and Japan, agile machines made of high-tech alloys that could climb hills with grace.
Schwinn's response to this revolution was a monument to stubbornness, the Schwinn Varsity. While the world moved toward lightweight chrome molybdenum steel, Schwinn doubled down on their proprietary electro-forging process, churning out frames that were virtually bomb-proof but weighed nearly 40 pounds. For a few years, the sheer power of the Schwinn brand masked the problem. They sold millions of Varsities simply because they were Schwinns. But beneath the sales figures, the company was rotting. They were selling 19th century technology to a 20th century market, arrogantly convinced that the American consumer would never choose a flimsy foreign bike over good old Chicago steel. They were wrong. As the bike boom of the 70s reached a fever pitch, the Chicago factory physically couldn't keep up with demand. Management faced a critical crossroads: invest millions to modernize their aging, inefficient plant, or outsource production to keep costs down. In a decision that would seal their fate, they looked to the east. They partnered with a small, unknown manufacturer in Taiwan called Giant Bicycles. Schwinn sent their engineers to Taiwan, handing over blueprints, trade secrets, and quality control standards. They essentially taught their future replacement how to build a world-class bicycle. For years, this arrangement seemed profitable. Schwinn focused on marketing, while Giant handled the messy business of manufacturing. But slowly, the dynamic shifted. Giant became faster, better, and cheaper, while Schwinn's internal manufacturing capabilities atrophied. By the time Schwinn management realized they had created a monster, Giant was no longer just a supplier. They were a competitor, and they were ready to eat their teacher alive. The final death knell rang in 1980, not from a boardroom, but from the factory floor. The workers at the Chicago plant, feeling squeezed by inflation and threatened by the outsourcing, went on strike. The strike was bitter and prolonged, lasting for months. It was the excuse management had been waiting for. Claiming they could no longer afford American labor, they shut down the massive Chicago complex forever. The silence that fell over those halls was the sound of an empire dying. The machinery was sold off, the workers dispersed, and the soul of the company was hollowed out. To make matters worse, Schwinn completely missed the next great revolution, the mountain bike. Just as they had dismissed the 10-speed, they scoffed at the stunt bikes being ridden down California hillsides. By the time they tried to enter the market, agile competitors like Specialized and Trek, companies that didn't even exist when Schwinn was at its peak, had already conquered the terrain. By the late 1980s, the company was a ghost. They had no factory, their designs were dated, and their market share had collapsed from 25% to a pathetic 5%. They were drowning in debt, owing millions to the very Taiwanese suppliers they had empowered. In 1992, almost exactly 100 years after Ignaz Schwinn stepped off the boat with a dream of independence, the company filed for bankruptcy. The assets were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Today, the name Schwinn still exists, stamped on bicycles sold in big-box department stores next to lawn chairs and detergent. But the connection to Ignaz, to the obsessive engineering, to the pride of Chicago industry, is gone. It is a stark reminder that in business, you are either innovating or you are dying, and no amount of nostalgia can save a dynasty that refuses to look toward the future.
The most fatal error Schwinn committed was the confusion of brand heritage with market immunity. For decades, the company believed that the name Schwinn was strong enough to dictate what customers should want, rather than listening to what the market actually demanded. This arrogance created a dangerous blind spot known as the competency trap.
Because they were the undisputed masters of heavy, durable cantilever steel bicycles, they viewed the shift toward lightweight European racing bikes and rugged off-road mountain bikes not as an existential threat, but as a temporary fad beneath their dignity. By the time they acknowledged these shifts, agile competitors like Trek and Specialized, who didn't have 80 years of tradition holding them back, had already captured the hearts of the consumer. The lesson here is stark. The moment a company falls in love with its past successes, it loses the ability to secure its future. Nostalgia is a marketing tool, not a business strategy. Perhaps the most textbook case of corporate suicide was Schwinn's mishandling of outsourcing, which serves as a cautionary tale for modern manufacturing. When Schwinn partnered with Giant Bicycles in Taiwan, they didn't just outsource the labor, they outsourced the institutional knowledge. They handed over blueprints, engineering standards, and process efficiencies to a third party to save money in the short term. In doing so, they effectively trained their own replacement. They failed to realize that manufacturing is innovation. When you stop making things, you stop understanding how to make them better. Giant absorbed Schwinn's expertise, combined it with lower costs, and inevitably launched their own brand, cutting out the middleman. Schwinn had hollowed out its own core competency, transforming from a manufacturer into a mere marketing shell, leaving them defenseless when their supplier decided to become their predator.
Finally, the Schwinn saga illustrates the fatal cost of operational rigidity in a rapidly evolving economy. Ignaz Schwinn built his empire by constantly upgrading, moving from bicycles to motorcycles and back, always chasing the cutting edge of technology. His descendants, however, became paralyzed by their own infrastructure. The massive Chicago factory, once a symbol of strength, became an albatross. Management refused to invest in modernizing the plant in the 1970s because the costs looked too high on a balance sheet, opting instead for the cheaper route of overseas production. This short-term financial thinking ignored the long-term cost of obsolescence. By refusing to cannibalize their own aging products and processes to build something new, they guaranteed that someone else would do it for them. True resilience requires the willingness to destroy your own best-selling products to invent their successors before a competitor does.